David Everett by Peter Lamb. Author's note: I lived next door to David Everett in Rossarden in the 1960s. I remember him flying a Nazi flag in his backyard before I knew what it was. Chapter 1: The Foundations of Ideals. Rossarden was a town etched into the rugged wilderness of Tasmania. It sat in a valley surrounded by dense forests and the haunting silhouettes of mountains, its air thick with the grit of a mining community. David Everett grew up in this isolated world where life was raw and hard, and resilience was forged in the fires of adversity. Rossarden was a town that bred survivors. The mines were its lifeblood, and most families depended on them for their livelihood. David's father, Harold Everett, worked long hours underground, emerging each evening with coal-streaked skin and weary eyes. His mother, Margaret, kept the household afloat with equal determination, raising her children with a firm hand and a warm heart. David was the middle child in a family of 5. From an early age, he displayed a curiosity that set him apart. While other boys ran wild in the bush, chasing wallabies and climbing gum trees, David would sit quietly by the creek near their home, watching the water carve its path through the rocks. He often wondered if people were like rivers, shaped by the obstacles they encountered. His older brother, Jack, was the epitome of the rough-and-tumble miner's son, with ambitions to follow their father into the mines. David admired Jack's strength, but couldn't imagine a life spent underground. His younger sister, Ellie, was the dreamer of the family, constantly sketching animals and plants she saw in the bush. It was Ellie who first noticed David's knack for observing details others missed. "Look at this," she once said, holding up a drawing of a kookaburra she'd finished. "I only got the beak right because you told me how it curves, just so." Their bond was special, and Ellie's artistic pursuits often served as an escape from the harsh realities of their upbringing. It was through her eyes that David began to see the world's complexities, even in a place as seemingly simple as Rossarden. Formative experiences. David's moral compass began to take shape during his early encounters with injustice. One incident stood out vividly in his memory. He was 10 years old when he witnessed a heated argument between his father and the mine's foreman. The man had denied Harold and several others their promised overtime pay, citing budget cuts. Harold, usually a quiet man, stood his ground. "We broke our backs for that money, and you know it," Harold said, his voice trembling with controlled anger. "Take it or leave it," the foreman replied, his tone dripping with indifference. David watched from a distance as his father eventually walked away, shoulders slumped. The sense of helplessness etched itself into David's mind, planting the first seeds of rebellion against authority figures who abused their power. It wasn't long before David found his own ways to challenge unfairness. At school, he once stood up for a smaller boy being bullied by a group of older kids. Though the confrontation left him bruised, the gratitude in the boy's eyes made it worth it. These small acts of defiance became a hallmark of his personality. Education and ambition. Rossarden's school was a modest affair, a single building with peeling paint and a yard that turned to mud whenever it rained. Despite the lack of resources, David thrived academically. His teachers recognized his sharp intellect and encouraged him to aim higher than the mines. "David, you've got a mind for strategy," his teacher, Mrs. Carter, told him one day after class. "Have you ever thought about joining the military? The army could use someone like you." The suggestion stuck. The military offered an escape from Rossarden, a chance to see the world and make a difference. For David, it also seemed like a place where fairness and discipline reigned, far removed from the arbitrary injustices he'd seen in the mines. A shifting perspective. As David grew older, his understanding of the world expanded. He devoured books on history and politics, often borrowing well-worn volumes from the small local library. Stories of resistance against oppression captivated him, from tales of the Australian diggers during the Eureka Rebellion to accounts of freedom fighters in distant lands. By the time he turned 16, David had begun to see Rossarden not as a home, but as a crucible. It had forged his values, but its limitations chafed against his ambitions. When he finally left to join the Australian Army, he did so with a mix of excitement and trepidation, knowing he was stepping into a world far larger and more complicated than the one he was leaving behind. Chapter 2: Becoming a Soldier. When David Everett enlisted in the Australian Army at the age of 18, it felt like stepping into another world. Gone were the familiar sights of Rossarden, the towering gum trees, the rugged mining roads, the cold streams cutting through the valley. In their place stood the rigid structures of military life, barracks that echoed with shouted commands, obstacle courses designed to break both body and spirit, and a culture where discipline was both a shield and a weapon. David thrived in this environment. From the moment he arrived at the recruit training depot, it became clear he was cut from a different cloth. While others struggled to adapt to the intense physical and mental demands, David excelled. His upbringing in Rossarden had instilled a toughness that allowed him to push through pain and fatigue, and his sharp intellect made him a natural at understanding complex tactics and strategies. The making of a leader. It wasn't long before David's superiors took notice. His drill sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Jenkins, often singled him out during training exercises. "Everett," Jenkins barked one afternoon as the recruits stood at attention, mud caked to their boots. "What's the best way to neutralize an enemy position on high ground?" Without hesitation, David replied, "Approach under cover, use suppressing fire to distract, then flank them from the weaker side." Jenkins nodded approvingly. "You'll go far if you keep using that brain of yours." David's peers began to look up to him, not just because of his tactical skills, but also because of his ability to keep a cool head under pressure. During one grueling navigation exercise, a teammate twisted his ankle in the middle of the bush. While others debated what to do, David took charge, fashioning a splint from tree branches and leading the group to safety. Special Air Service Regiment. David's success in basic training opened doors to opportunities most soldiers could only dream of. He applied for selection into the Special Air Service Regiment (SR), Australia's elite special forces unit. The selection process was notorious for its brutality, designed to push candidates to their physical and mental limits. The first week of selection was grueling. Candidates were subjected to relentless physical tests, from long-distance marches with heavy packs to obstacle courses that seemed designed by sadists. Sleep deprivation and hunger were constant companions. By the end of the week, half of the candidates had already dropped out. David refused to quit. Each challenge became a test of his resolve, a reminder of why he was there. When he thought of giving up, he pictured his father walking away from the foreman, his shoulders slumped in defeat. David had vowed never to feel that kind of powerlessness again. By the time the selection process ended, David was among the few who remained. His acceptance into the SASR was a moment of immense pride, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test his ideals in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The reality of war. As an SAS operative, David quickly found himself deployed to some of the world's most volatile regions. His first major deployment was to Southeast Asia, where Australia had been conducting covert operations. The missions were shrouded in secrecy, often involving reconnaissance, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. David excelled in the field. His ability to think on his feet and adapt to changing circumstances made him an asset to his team. Yet the more time he spent in the shadows of international conflict, the more he began to question the nature of his work. One mission, in particular, haunted him. Tasked with gathering intelligence on a rebel group suspected of trafficking weapons, David and his team had to infiltrate a remote village. The operation went smoothly, until it didn't. A skirmish broke out, and in the chaos, several civilians were caught in the crossfire. Though the mission was deemed a success, David couldn't shake the image of a young boy clutching his mother's lifeless body. Back at base, David began to withdraw his comrades. He spent long nights alone, staring at maps and reports, trying to make sense of the broader picture. The official justifications for their missions felt hollow, and the disconnect between political rhetoric and on-the-ground reality became increasingly clear. Disillusionment takes root. It wasn't just the missions that troubled David, it was the system itself. He began to see the military not as a force for justice, but as a tool of larger, often self-serving powers. The more he learned about the global political landscape, the more disillusioned he became. He tried to voice his concerns to his superiors, but his questions were met with terse responses. "Your job is to follow orders, Everett," one officer told him. "Leave the politics to the politicians." David found solace in the writings of revolutionary thinkers and military philosophers. He read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Che Guevara's memoirs, and even Machiavelli's The Prince. These texts became a source of both inspiration and internal conflict, fueling his desire to act on his convictions while deepening his doubts about the system he served. The first seeds of rebellion. The breaking point came during a mission that exposed him to the true cost of collateral damage. Ordered to destroy a supply depot believed to be aiding enemy forces, David and his team carried out the operation with precision. But afterward, they discovered the depot had also been used to store medical supplies for local villagers. The destruction left an already struggling community in dire straits. David's frustration boiled over. He began to see himself not as a protector, but as a pawn in a game he didn't believe in. The sense of duty that had once driven him was now at odds with his growing sense of injustice. It was during these moments of reflection that the idea of desertion first crept into his mind. At first it was a fleeting thought, something he dismissed as impossible. But the more he grappled with his conscience, the more the idea took root. He began to wonder if he could make a greater impact outside the confines of the military, if he could fight for justice on his own terms. Chapter 3. The Tipping Point. David Everett's transformation from a soldier to a renegade was not a sudden leap, but a gradual unraveling of conviction. The Australian Army had trained him to follow orders, to uphold discipline, and to believe in the righteousness of his mission. Yet, with every passing day, those beliefs crumbled under the weight of doubt and disillusionment. A mission that changed everything. The moment that would define David's life came during a covert operation in Southeast Asia. His unit was tasked with disrupting a supply chain allegedly supporting insurgent forces. Intelligence suggested that a key shipment of weapons was en route to a rebel base hidden in the dense jungle. The mission was clear: intercept and destroy. David and his team executed the operation with their usual precision. They ambushed the convoy at dawn, neutralizing the guards with minimal casualties. The cache of weapons was destroyed with controlled explosives, and the team retreated into the jungle. It wasn't until later that they discovered the convoy had also been transporting food, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies. The supplies were intended for displaced villagers caught in the crossfire of the conflict. The destruction of the convoy had condemned those villagers to hunger and disease. As the team debriefed, David's commanding officer dismissed the collateral damage as an unfortunate but necessary part of war. "You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs," he said, lighting a cigarette with an air of detachment. David stared at the smoldering ashes of the convoy, his stomach churning. For the first time, he questioned not just the mission, but the entire structure that had brought him there. How many other necessary casualties had he been complicit in? How many lives had been shattered by the invisible hand of military policy? The breaking point. Back at base, David found himself unable to shake the images of starving children and grieving families. He spent sleepless nights replaying the mission in his mind, searching for some justification that might ease his guilt. But none came. He began avoiding his comrades, isolating himself from the camaraderie that had once been his refuge. Instead, he buried himself in books and writings that challenged the status quo. He revisited Che Guevara's memoirs and found himself drawn to the idea of fighting for a cause greater than oneself. He read about freedom fighters, revolutionaries, and whistleblowers, men and women who had dared to stand against powerful systems in pursuit of justice. David's disillusionment deepened when he uncovered more about the broader geopolitical game being played. He realized that the conflict was not as black and white as it had been painted. The insurgents they were fighting were not faceless enemies, but desperate people driven to resistance by corruption and exploitation. In some ways, they were no different from the villagers he had grown up with in Rossarden. Ordinary people trying to survive in extraordinary circumstances. The idea of desertion began as a whisper in the back of David's mind. At first, he dismissed it as a fleeting thought, the product of exhaustion and frustration. But the more he reflected on his role in the machine, the louder that whisper grew. He began to plan in secret, mapping out the steps he would need to take. Disappearing from the military wouldn't be easy. The SAS had trained him to survive, but they had also trained him to track and capture. He knew the risks. Desertion was a crime that carried severe consequences. If caught, he would face dishonorable discharge, imprisonment, or worse. But the alternative, continuing to serve a system he no longer believed in, felt unbearable. David was no longer fighting for justice. He was complicit in perpetuating the very injustices he had joined the military to oppose. A fateful decision. The tipping point came during a routine patrol in the jungle. David's unit encountered a group of villagers fleeing their homes. They were gaunt, their eyes hollow with fear. One woman clutched a baby wrapped in a dirty blanket, her expression a mask of desperation. "Help us," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please help us." David's commanding officer ordered the villagers to return to their settlement, warning them not to stray into restricted areas. The soldiers moved on, leaving the villagers to fend for themselves. David lingered, his heart pounding. He wanted to help, to give them food, water, anything. But he knew the rules. To disobey an order was to risk court-martial. Reluctantly, he followed his team, but the image of the woman and her child haunted him long after the patrol ended. That night, as he lay awake in his bunk, David made his decision. He would leave the military. He would find a way to fight for justice on his own terms, even if it meant becoming an outlaw. The uniform that had once been a symbol of pride now felt like a shackle, binding him to a system he could no longer serve. The first steps. David's departure from the military was both meticulous and impulsive. He knew he couldn't simply walk away. He had to vanish without a trace. Over the course of weeks, he began siphoning supplies, rations, medical kits, and navigation tools into a hidden cache. He memorized escape routes and studied the terrain, preparing for the moment he would make his move. The opportunity came during a training exercise deep in the jungle. Under the cover of night, David slipped away from his team, moving silently through the underbrush. He knew they would discover his absence by morning, but by then, he would be miles away. As dawn broke over the jungle, David found himself alone for the first time in years. He felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. He was no longer bound by orders or protocols. His fate was his own to decide. But as he ventured deeper into the unknown, he couldn't help but wonder, had he escaped the machine, or had he merely stepped into another kind of battle, one he was not yet prepared to fight? Chapter 4. A Life on the Run. David Everett's disappearance sent ripples through the Australian military. A deserter was rare enough, but an SAS operative vanishing into thin air was almost unheard of. It sparked a flurry of activity among military intelligence and law enforcement, who launched an immediate manhunt. For David, the hunt was confirmation of what he already knew. He had become a fugitive, a man with no place in the system he had once served. The first days of freedom. The first few days after his desertion were a blur of movement and caution. David navigated the dense jungle with the expertise of a seasoned survivalist, avoiding trails and landmarks that might give away his position. He relied on his training, which had taught him to live off the land, to stay hidden, and to move with purpose. The jungle was both his ally and his enemy. Its thick canopy provided cover, but its oppressive heat and swarms of insects tested his endurance. He survived on a mix of foraged fruits, small game, and the rations he had taken from his unit. Water was plentiful, but even so, he was careful to boil it, knowing the dangers of unseen contaminants. Despite the hardships, David felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, he was free of orders, free of bureaucracy, free of the machine. The jungle, with all its dangers and challenges, felt more honest than the world he had left behind. Finding a new path. After days of trekking through the wilderness, David emerged into the outskirts of a small Southeast Asian village. It was a place untouched by modernity, where life moved at a slower pace, and the struggles of its people were written on their weathered faces. David kept his distance at first, observing from the shadows. He had no intention of putting the villagers at risk, knowing that anyone who helped him might face retribution if he were discovered. But as he watched the villagers go about their daily lives, farming, cooking, and caring for their children, he felt a pang of connection. These were the people he had wanted to protect, the ones he had failed to help during his missions. When hunger and exhaustion finally forced him to reveal himself, David approached the village cautiously, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. The villagers were wary at first, but his obvious need and lack of aggression eventually won them over. An elderly woman offered him a bowl of rice and a place to sleep in exchange for his help with their daily tasks. In the weeks that followed, David became a quiet presence in the village. He helped repair tools, tended to crops, and used his medical training to treat minor injuries. The villagers, in turn, taught him their ways of living off the land, showing him how to navigate the jungle with an intimacy he had never known. Joining the resistance. It was through this village that David first made contact with the resistance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the jungle came alive with the hum of insects, a group of armed men arrived. They were part of a rebel faction fighting against the corrupt regime that had oppressed their people for decades. David listened as the rebels spoke of their struggle. They told stories of forced labor, stolen resources, and the brutal suppression of dissent. It was a story he had heard before, in different forms, in different places. But this time, it felt personal. These were the people who had suffered the consequences of his missions, the ones he had unwittingly harmed. When the rebels invited him to join their cause, David hesitated. He knew the dangers of aligning himself with a faction. Their ideals might be noble, but their methods often blurred the line between justice and vengeance. Yet as he looked around at the villagers who had taken him in, he felt a sense of responsibility. He could not change the past, but perhaps he could make amends by fighting for their future, learning to fight a new way. David's transition from soldier to insurgent was not seamless. The structured discipline of the SAS was worlds apart from the chaotic reality of guerrilla warfare. The rebels relied on hit-and-run tactics, sabotage, and improvisation. Resources were scarce, and every mission carried the risk of betrayal or failure. But David adapted quickly. He shared his knowledge of strategy and tactics, teaching the rebels how to plan operations with precision and efficiency. In return, they taught him to navigate the jungle with the instincts of a native, to move silently through the underbrush, and to blend into the shadows. His first operation with the rebels was a raid on a government outpost. The objective was to seize supplies and disrupt the regime's operations in the region. David's plan was meticulous, and the execution was almost flawless. The rebels struck swiftly, overwhelming the guards and escaping with weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies. The success of the raid cemented David's place among the rebels. They began to see him not just as an outsider, but as one of their own. He earned their trust through his actions, proving that he was willing to risk his life for their cause. The beginning of a legend. As the months turned into years, David's reputation grew. Stories of his exploits spread across the region, painting him as a figure of mythic proportions. Some saw him as a hero, a modern-day Robin Hood fighting against oppression. Others saw him as a dangerous renegade, a traitor who had turned his back on his country. The Australian government, alarmed by reports of his activities, intensified their efforts to capture him. They labeled him a fugitive, a terrorist, and a threat to national security. But for every lead they followed, David seemed to stay one step ahead. He moved like a ghost, slipping through their grasp time and time again. For David, life on the run was both exhilarating and exhausting. He found purpose in the fight, but he also felt the weight of his choices. The life he had chosen came at a cost. Relationships were fleeting, trust was scarce, and every day was a battle for survival. Yet, in the quiet moments between missions, David would reflect on his journey. He knew he could never return to the life he had left behind, but he also knew that he was fighting for something he believed in. For better or worse, he had become a man of the shadows, a life defined not by the system he had abandoned, but by the ideals he sought to uphold. Chapter 5. The Pursuer and the Pursued. While David Everett built his reputation as a renegade and a shadow in the jungles of Southeast Asia, his absence cast a long shadow over the Australian authorities. The hunt for Everett was as much a matter of national pride as it was a pursuit of justice. The man tasked with leading that hunt was Inspector Robert "Robbie" Mackenzie, a veteran officer known for his relentless determination and ability to get inside the minds of his targets. The mind of a hunter. For Mackenzie, David Everett was not just a fugitive. He was a puzzle, a riddle to be solved. As head of the task force assembled to locate Everett, Mackenzie quickly realized this was no ordinary case. Everett's training in the SAS made him a uniquely challenging adversary. He was an expert in survival, a master of evasion, and someone who understood the very tactics being used to track him. Mackenzie spent countless hours studying Everett's file, poring over reports from his military career, the circumstances of his desertion, and the intelligence trickling in about his activities with the rebels. He created a psychological profile, trying to understand what drove Everett, what could compel a man with such promise to turn his back on everything. He's not just a criminal, Mackenzie told his team during one briefing. He's an idealist. That makes him dangerous. He truly believes what he's doing is right. Close calls and narrow escapes. The hunt for Everett stretched across continents, with leads emerging from jungles, villages, and even urban centers where Everett occasionally surfaced. Mackenzie's team coordinated with local authorities, intelligence agencies, and military units, creating a vast network of operatives dedicated to capturing the elusive Renegade. Despite their efforts, Everett remained one step ahead. He used his training to evade detection, employing diversionary tactics that left his pursuers chasing shadows. On one occasion, Mackenzie's team raided a safe house believed to be Everett's base of operations, only to find it abandoned hours earlier. The only clue left behind was a makeshift map, deliberately planted to mislead his hunters. For Mackenzie, these near misses were both frustrating and fascinating. Each failed attempt offered a glimpse into Everett's mind, a chance to refine his understanding of the man he was chasing. A game of cat and mouse. The dynamic between Everett and Mackenzie began to resemble a chess match, with each man anticipating the other's moves. Everett knew he was being hunted and took precautions to stay ahead. He changed his appearance, moved frequently, and relied on a network of sympathizers who believed in his cause. Mackenzie, meanwhile, adapted his tactics. He studied Everett's patterns, identifying the causes and principles that seemed to drive him. He realized that Everett's actions were not random. They were calculated, designed to strike at symbols of oppression and inequality. One pivotal moment came when Everett orchestrated a daring raid on a government-controlled supply depot. The operation was audacious, carried out with surgical precision. It was a victory for the rebels, but it also left behind a trail of clues, subtle details that Mackenzie recognized as part of a larger strategy. "He's sending a message," Mackenzie said during a debriefing. "This isn't just about survival. He wants us to know he's still out there, fighting for what he believes in." The toll of the hunt. The pursuit of David Everett took a toll on both men. For Mackenzie, the relentless chase consumed his life. He spent long hours in dimly lit offices, poring over maps and reports, trying to outthink a man who seemed to live in the shadows. His obsession with capturing Everett strained his relationships, leaving him isolated and driven by a singular purpose. For Everett, the constant evasion was a double-edged sword. While he relished the challenge of staying one step ahead, the isolation and secrecy weighed heavily on him. He missed the camaraderie of the military, the sense of belonging that had once defined his life. The cause he had embraced gave him purpose, but it also demanded sacrifices, friendships, stability, and any semblance of a normal life. In quieter moments, both men grappled with the moral complexities of their roles. Mackenzie began to question whether capturing Everett would truly bring justice or if it was simply an act of enforcing a flawed system. Everett, in turn, wondered whether his actions were making a difference or if he was merely perpetuating a cycle of violence. The meeting of minds. The first direct confrontation between Everett and Mackenzie occurred not in a jungle or a village, but in the bustling streets of a Southeast Asian city. Acting on a tip, Mackenzie's team staged an operation to intercept Everett during a supply exchange. The plan was meticulous, with agents stationed at key locations to cut off Everett's escape routes. But as the operation unfolded, it became clear that Everett had anticipated the ambush. He moved through the crowd with calculated ease, evading his pursuers at every turn. It was Mackenzie himself who finally cornered Everett in an alleyway. For a brief moment, the two men faced each other, their eyes locking in a silent exchange. Mackenzie saw a man who was both weary and resolute, driven by convictions that defied easy categorization. Everett, in turn, saw a hunter who was not just an enforcer of the law, but someone who genuinely sought to understand him. The standoff ended with Everett's escape, but the encounter left a lasting impression on both men. For Mackenzie, it reinforced the complexity of his quarry, a man who was neither hero nor villain, but something in between. For Everett, it was a reminder that even his enemies were human, capable of empathy and understanding. The chase continues. As the hunt dragged on, the line between pursuer and pursued began to blur. Mackenzie found himself questioning not just Everett's motives, but his own. What drove him to continue the chase? Was it duty, justice, or something more personal? Everett, meanwhile, began to see Mackenzie as more than just an adversary. The inspector's persistence and insight forced him to confront his own actions, to question whether his fight for justice was truly making a difference. In the end, their shared humanity became the defining element of their conflict. Though they stood on opposite sides of the law, both men were bound by their pursuit of something greater: justice, truth, and a sense of purpose. Chapter 6: Redemption's Echo. David Everett's journey as a fugitive had brought him to the edge of the world, both literally and figuratively. The jungles, villages, and battlegrounds where he had fought and evaded capture felt like distant memories now, replaced by a more introspective struggle. The ideals that had once burned so brightly in his mind were now shadowed by the cost of his actions. And though he was far from the man he had been in the military, he was also far from the man he wanted to be. For Inspector Robert Mackenzie, the pursuit of Everett had become an almost existential quest. Each step closer to capturing his quarry was another step toward understanding him. Mackenzie no longer viewed Everett as just a fugitive. He saw him as a mirror, one that reflected the complexities of duty, justice, and morality. A bold plan. In the small, impoverished Australian town of Bindara, nestled at the edge of a sprawling bushland, Everett found himself at a crossroads. The town's people had been devastated by corporate greed, their livelihoods stripped away by a mining conglomerate that had exploited the land and left nothing in its wake but polluted water and barren soil. Everett felt an affinity for the people of Bindara. Their struggles reminded him of Rossarden, the mining town of his youth. He saw in their eyes the same quiet desperation he had seen in his father's the day the foreman denied him his rightful pay. This connection compelled Everett to act. He began to organize the townsfolk, teaching them tactics for nonviolent resistance. But as the weeks passed, Everett realized that resistance alone would not be enough to bring real change. The company's wealth and power were insurmountable through peaceful means alone. That was when Everett conceived of his boldest plan yet, a heist to redistribute the wealth of a corrupt mining mogul back to the community. The operation would involve infiltrating the mogul's private estate, extracting financial records and valuables, and exposing the corruption to the world. The final confrontation. Unbeknownst to Everett, Mackenzie's team had been monitoring his movements more closely than ever. Intercepted communications and local tips had allowed them to track him to Bindara. Mackenzie knew this would be his best chance to finally apprehend the elusive fugitive. On the night of the heist, as Everett and his small team of locals made their move, Mackenzie's task force moved into position. The estate, shrouded in darkness, became a chessboard for the ultimate confrontation. Everett's team worked with precision, disabling alarms and accessing the estate's vault, but the tension was palpable. As Everett emerged from the estate with a briefcase full of damning documents, he found himself face to face with Mackenzie. The inspector had anticipated his exit strategy and was waiting for him near the edge of the property. "David Everett," Mackenzie said, his voice steady. "It's over." Everett stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his journey pressing down on him. He glanced at the briefcase in his hand, then back at Mackenzie. "If it's over, it's because you've decided it should be," he said quietly. A conversation of ideals. What followed was not the violent confrontation Mackenzie had expected, but a conversation that would linger in his mind for years to come. The two men, standing under the pale light of the moon, spoke not as hunter and prey but as equals. "You know I can't let you walk away," Mackenzie said. "No matter your intentions, the law is the law." "And what about justice?" Everett replied. "What about the people this system leaves behind? The ones no one hears because they don't have a voice?" Mackenzie hesitated. "Justice and the law aren't always the same thing, but there are rules for a reason. Without them, there's chaos." Everett shook his head. "There's already chaos. You just don't see it because it's hidden behind boardroom doors and political speeches." The exchange lasted only minutes, but in that time, both men came to understand each other in ways neither had expected. Mackenzie saw the humanity in Everett's rebellion, while Everett recognized the integrity in Mackenzie's pursuit of order. A choice made. In the end, it was Mackenzie who made the choice. Rather than arrest Everett on the spot, he allowed him to leave with the briefcase. "This isn't an endorsement," Mackenzie said firmly. "You'll answer for what you've done someday, Everett, but not tonight." Everett nodded, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "Maybe that's enough for now." As Everett disappeared into the bush, Mackenzie stood alone, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He knew he would face scrutiny from his superiors for letting Everett slip through his fingers, but in that moment he felt he had done what was right, not just by the law, but by his own conscience. The aftermath. The heist at Bindara became a turning point for both men. The documents Everett had taken exposed widespread corruption within the mining conglomerate, leading to public outrage and government investigations. For the people of Bindara, it was a rare victory, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak existence. Mackenzie, meanwhile, faced internal inquiries into his handling of the case. Though his actions were criticized, he defended his decision, arguing that capturing Everett was less important than understanding the systemic issues that had driven him to act. For Everett, the Bindara operation marked the beginning of a new phase in his journey. He remained a fugitive, but his actions began to focus more on exposing corruption and advocating for the disenfranchised. Though his methods were still controversial, his intentions became harder to dismiss. Chapter 7. Legacy of the Elusive Shadow. The capture of David Everett had eluded Inspector Robert Mackenzie for years, but the Bindara operation signified a shift in both men's lives. For Everett, it was a moment of clarity about the fight he had chosen and the legacy he hoped to leave. For Mackenzie, it was an acknowledgement of the complexities of justice and the fragile line between right and wrong. A symbol of rebellion. In the months following the Bindara heist, David Everett's reputation grew into something of a legend. Stories of his exploits spread far beyond the small towns and jungles where they had taken place. He became a symbol of rebellion for those disillusioned with systems of power, a figure whose actions spoke to the frustrations of the disenfranchised. Songs, poems, and even murals began appearing in his honor, depicting him as a modern-day Robin Hood. Yet, the reality of his life was far more complex. While some hailed him as a hero, others labeled him a criminal, a dangerous renegade who undermined law and order. The media was divided in its portrayal of Everett. Some outlets painted him as a ruthless vigilante, while others highlighted his role in exposing corruption and advocating for justice. Regardless of the narrative, one thing was clear. David Everett had become a household name. Mackenzie's reflection. For Mackenzie, the aftermath of the Bindara operation was bittersweet. His decision to let Everett go weighed heavily on him, and he faced scrutiny from both his superiors and his peers. Yet, he stood by his choice, believing that justice was not always about enforcing the law, but about understanding the larger picture. Mackenzie continued his work in law enforcement, but the hunt for Everett remained a defining chapter of his career. He often found himself reflecting on their final conversation, replaying Everett's words in his mind. The fugitive had forced him to confront questions he had long avoided. What did justice truly mean? Was the system he served as infallible as he had once believed? Over time, Mackenzie began to view Everett not as an enemy, but as a man driven by conviction. He recognized the parallels between their lives, the shared desire to make a difference, the sacrifices they had both made in pursuit of their ideals. Though they had stood on opposite sides of the law, they were, in many ways, kindred spirits. Everett's final mission. David Everett's life as a fugitive was one of constant movement. He traveled across continents, adopting new identities and building networks of allies who shared his vision. Yet as the years passed, he began to feel the weight of his choices. The isolation, the sacrifices, and the unending fight for justice took their toll. In his final years, Everett shifted his focus from direct action to mentorship. He began working behind the scenes, training others to carry on the fight. He shared his knowledge of strategy, tactics, and survival, passing on the lessons he had learned over a lifetime of struggle. His last known act was an operation to expose human rights abuses in a war-torn region. Working with a group of local activists, Everett orchestrated the release of evidence that led to international intervention and the prosecution of key perpetrators. It was a fitting end to his journey, a reminder of the ideals that had driven him from the beginning. The legacy of the elusive shadow. David Everett's story did not end with his disappearance. His legacy lived on in the people he had inspired, the causes he had championed, and the changes he had helped bring about. For those who knew him, he was more than just a symbol. He was a man of principle, a flawed yet unwavering advocate for justice. In the annals of Australian history, Everett's name occupies a unique place. He is remembered not just as a fugitive or a rebel, but as a figure who challenged the status quo, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about power, corruption, and the meaning of justice. For Inspector Mackenzie, the story of David Everett remained a source of reflection long after the hunt had ended. Though they had been adversaries, their lives had intersected in profound ways, shaping each other in ways neither could have anticipated. Mackenzie often wondered what might have been if circumstances had been different, if Everett had found a way to fight within the system rather than outside it. An unfinished story. The tale of David Everett remains both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It is a reminder of the complexities of human nature, the thin line between heroism and villainy, and the enduring struggle for justice in an imperfect world. For some, he is a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope for those who feel unheard and unseen. For others, he is a warning, a reminder of the chaos that can arise when ideals are pursued without regard for the consequences. In the end, David Everett's legacy is not defined by the laws he broke or the battles he fought. It is defined by the questions he left behind. What does it mean to be truly free? What is the cost of justice? And how far would you go to stand by your convictions?